The girl, though young, carried a presence that seemed to calm even the most restless hearts around her. At the tender age of 12, she possessed a gentle charm, the kind that made her presence soothing to both animals and people alike. Her hair, often braided neatly by her own careful hands or her mother's before she passed, glimmered in the sunlight, soft and well-kept, framing a face that reflected innocence and curiosity in equal measure. Her eyes, large and dark, seemed to absorb the world with quiet wonder, reflecting a soul that saw kindness even in the smallest of things. Her daily life, though simple, was filled with little rituals that brought both her and those around her comfort. From the early hours of dawn, she would rise with the first rays of sunlight, stretching her limbs and listening to the gentle chorus of the village birds greeting the day. There was a rhythm to her life, a calmness that made her days predictable yet filled with small delights. Each morning, she would fetch water from the nearby stream, balancing a clay pot on her head with ease that belied her youth. Along the way, she would greet every villager she passed, offering a nod, a smile, or a soft word of encouragement. Her kindness was not performative, it was an instinctive part of her nature. Even the smallest creatures felt her gentleness. Chickens followed her with a soft clucking sound as she moved through the dusty paths, while stray dogs often lingered nearby, sensing that she meant no harm. She tended to her younger siblings with a careful patience that often went unnoticed by her stepmother but never by those who knew her true character. Her love for them was quiet and unwavering. She would braid their hair, prepare their simple meals, and soothe their fears with whispered stories of better days and imagined adventures beyond the village hills. Her personality was a rare blend of humility and intelligence. While many of her peers ran after childish games or the fleeting entertainments of the village, she found joy in observing and learning. She watched the elders as they performed their daily tasks, memorizing their movements and the lessons behind them. The rhythm of farming, the art of preparing food, the manner of bargaining at the small market stalls, all fascinated her. She asked questions not out of mischief but out of a genuine desire to understand the world. Even in her innocence, there was a perceptiveness that often made villagers remark on her sharpness. Yet she never let this wisdom breed arrogance. Instead, it was paired with a rare humility, and she used what she knew to help those around her, often without recognition. Her kindness extended to the larger community as well. She would offer assistance to neighbors, helping carry heavy loads of firewood, or guiding an elderly woman across uneven paths. In the evenings, she would gather herbs from the surrounding fields and make little remedies for minor ailments, knowing the proper mixtures only from careful observation of her grandmother's earlier instructions. The villagers, though some took her help for granted, could not deny the warmth and sincerity that accompanied every act of generosity. Even in the face of minor inconveniences, spilled water, a tripping chicken, or an ungrateful word, she responded with patience, never letting anger or resentment take root in her heart. Her spirit was resilient, and her innocence was not naivete. Rather, it was a conscious choice to see good, to give good, and to believe that the world could be kind if only one acted with purity. Small joys filled her life, moments that painted her world in soft colors despite the hardships that even the simplest of villagers endured. She delighted in the morning songs of birds, the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind, and the first touch of dew on her bare feet as she walked through the fields. She loved to watch the sunset with a quiet reverence, imagining stories for each changing hue of the sky, stories that she would later tell to her siblings or the village children. Music brought her happiness as well. She would hum melodies learned from wandering minstrels or create rhythms by tapping sticks against stones. These simple pleasures, though fleeting, nourished her spirit and helped her find balance in a world that was not always gentle. Dreams filled her nights. She often imagined traveling beyond the village, seeing the great forests her father once described, or the mountains that loomed like silent guardians in the distance. She hoped for a life where her talents could be recognized, where she could learn, love, and be respected for the kindness she so freely offered. Yet, these dreams were never boastful. They existed quietly in her mind, a personal solace that reminded her she was capable of more than the small confines of her immediate world. She longed for love, not in the selfish sense but as a mutual respect and understanding, a connection that honored her gentle nature and rewarded her quiet diligence. Her trust in the goodness of people, though tested by minor disappointments, remained unwavering. Her world before misfortune was simple but stable. There was a balance in her daily life, tasks and rest, joy and learning, care for others and self-reflection. Her interactions with villagers, elders, and children provided a network of subtle support and admiration, even if not always vocalized. She had friends, those who recognized her kindness and reciprocated it in small ways, sharing laughter or providing assistance in moments of need. The rhythm of life carried her gently along, shaping her into someone who was both humble and quietly strong, preparing her for the trials that she did not yet know awaited her. Even under the watchful eye of a stepmother whose gaze often carried a shadow of disdain, she maintained her innocence and grace. She would obey household rules, complete her chores and offer respectful words, all the while dreaming, hoping, and nurturing the seeds of a character that would one day command both respect and awe. Her world, though limited in material wealth, was rich in kindness, learning, and dreams, forming a foundation of character that would endure the hardships to come. Each smile she gave, each act of help, and each whispered dream built a life of quiet dignity, making her a beacon of gentle strength in a world that was only beginning to reveal its darker edges. The girl had always taken pride in her small possessions, treasures that might have seemed insignificant to others but held great meaning to her. A worn satchel gifted by her mother before she passed, a few coins she had saved from helping neighbors, and simple trinkets she had collected from the woods, each represented her independence, her small joys, and her ability to care for herself despite the limitations placed upon her by her stepmother. She had believed, quietly, that as long as she held these tokens, she would always retain a part of her freedom and her dignity. Yet, that fragile sense of security was about to be shattered. One morning she discovered the absence of her possessions, each missing item leaving an invisible void, a sense of emptiness that gnawed at her from the inside out. Her satchel, the coins, her simple keepsakes, gone. And with them vanished the trust she had naively placed in those around her. Her stepmother's face, when confronted, was a mask of false innocence. "Perhaps you misplaced them," she said sweetly, though her eyes glimmered with barely restrained triumph. The girl, still young and trusting, wanted to believe the words, wanted to cling to some shred of hope that this was a mistake, not deliberate cruelty. But the evidence was undeniable. She searched every corner of her room, lifting mats, peering under floorboards, even checking the hidden spaces where small animals might have nested, yet nothing was left. Her hands trembled as realization set in. The theft was intentional, premeditated, and executed by those who claimed to love, or at least care for, her. Every ounce of faith she had in family and friends seemed to crumble, leaving her feeling unmoored, isolated, and vulnerable. The betrayal cut deeper than the loss of objects. More than the coins or the trinkets, it was the message behind the act. She was expendable, her happiness irrelevant, her dignity unworthy of protection. The stepmother had orchestrated the theft not merely for material gain but to assert power, to demonstrate control over the girl's life. Her siblings, if they were even complicit, acted as enablers, laughing behind her back or giving sly nods when she expressed her confusion. The household, once a place of routine and predictability, had become a theater of cruelty, and she the unwitting star of a performance written by malice. Even her neighbors, who might have intervened, remained silent. Some out of fear of crossing her stepmother, others perhaps because they preferred not to involve themselves in matters that did not concern them. The silence of the village was deafening, an unspoken conspiracy that deepened her sense of abandonment. Heartbreak became a constant companion. She wandered through her small living space, touching empty shelves and cold floorboards, trying to reconcile the reality before her with the memories of care and warmth she had once known. Each empty spot, each missing coin, reminded her of trust misplaced and innocence exploited. Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of anger, shame, and helplessness, yet she could not fully express these emotions. Tears streamed down her face in private moments, for the household demanded composure, and the villagers would not have understood anyway. Her grief was compounded by the knowledge that those who should have guided, protected, or comforted her instead enabled her tormentors through inaction. She felt as if the world had narrowed, leaving only herself to navigate a landscape of deceit and cruelty. Despite the overwhelming despair, small details drew her attention to the extent of the betrayal. She noticed the subtle glint of her stolen coins in her stepmother's belongings, the familiar stitching of her satchel repurposed for another, and the very trinkets she had cherished now displayed in places where others could admire them, as if to remind her of her subjugation. Each discovery sent waves of shock and anger coursing through her, yet the careful girl forced herself to remain calm. Panic or rash action would only render her powerless, and she had learned in those early years that patience, observation, and strategic thinking often provided the means for eventual justice. Still, the emotional toll was heavy, weighing down her shoulders and clouding her young mind with questions of trust, loyalty, and fairness. Isolation became both a physical and psychological condition. Friends she had confided in subtly avoided her, perhaps influenced by her stepmother's whispers or by their own fear of becoming targets of retribution. Even in the moments when she reached out for support, she encountered hesitation, doubt, or indifference. The absence of allies compounded the sting of betrayal. She understood, in a nascent but profound way, that evil could spread not just through active malice but through passivity, the quiet refusal of those who could intervene to do what is right. This knowledge, bitter as it was, would plant the seeds of future resolve within her. She realized that trust, while essential, could not be given blindly. It had to be earned, verified, and protected against those who would take advantage of kindness. In the midst of her heartbreak, she began to study her oppressors. Her stepmother's movements, expressions, and the small mannerisms that betrayed her duplicity became objects of attention. The girl catalogued their patterns, their alliances, and their vulnerabilities. She recognized that their greed and cruelty were their greatest weaknesses, and if she could survive this initial blow, she could one day turn the tables. The theft, though devastating, was also a lesson. It taught her to observe carefully, to anticipate deceit, and to understand that the world was as much a battlefield of wits as it was of circumstance. Her emotional pain became a crucible, forging a resilience she did not yet fully recognize but that would carry her through the trials ahead. By nightfall, she often sat quietly beneath the small window of her room, moonlight casting faint lines across the floor. She reflected on the events of the day, the unfairness of life, and the betrayal she had suffered. Though her heart was heavy, she felt the first stirrings of determination. If those around her had taken everything she held dear, she would, in time, learn to reclaim not only her possessions but also her dignity, her voice, and her place in the world. The silent villagers and the complicit family members were not omnipotent. Their power depended on her ignorance, her passivity. Now, knowledge of their treachery gave her leverage, and in the quiet of her sorrow, a spark of strategic thought began to glow. As the nights passed, she resolved to be patient, to endure, and to learn. The theft had stripped her of her tangible belongings, yet it could not remove her courage, her intelligence, or her capacity for hope. Her heartbreak became fuel, her betrayal a lesson in vigilance, and her solitude a space for reflection and growth. Though she felt the full weight of injustice, she also began to sense the potential for reversal, a cosmic balance that might one day favor the innocent. In this moment of loss and despair, she quietly vowed to herself that she would not remain powerless forever, that one day the scales would tip, and those who had wronged her would face the consequences of their greed and cruelty. In the long, lonely nights of exile, the girl began to notice things that defied ordinary explanation. At first, they were subtle, a flicker of light in the corner of her vision, a whisper carried on the wind that seemed to speak her name, or the faintest rustle of leaves when no creature could be seen. These occurrences were so quiet and fleeting that she questioned her own senses, wondering if hunger, fatigue, or despair were conjuring illusions. Yet the more they happened, the more certain she became that she was not truly alone. Something unseen watched over her, guiding, comforting, and protecting her in ways that human eyes could never perceive. The world, she realized, was larger and stranger than she had ever imagined, and her suffering had somehow awakened forces that had always lingered near her. Dreams, too, began to change in nature. No longer were they simple echoes of memory or imagination. She dreamed vividly of ancestors she had never met, of women and men whose eyes held wisdom and power. They spoke in voices that were both gentle and commanding, weaving lessons into their words. Strength comes from patience. The innocent hold power unseen. Your path is not yet clear, but your spirit is chosen. In these dreams she walked through landscapes both familiar and strange, forests that shimmered in moonlight, rivers of silver flowing against gravity, and temples carved from stone that hummed with energy. Each vision left her with a sense of purpose, a conviction that she was being prepared for something greater than mere survival. Though her body remained frail from hunger and exhaustion, her mind and spirit began to swell with clarity and resolve. Small omens accompanied her waking life as well. Birds often appeared in pairs, hovering nearby, their calls seeming almost melodic, as if they were trying to communicate messages she could not yet decipher. Occasionally, a gust of wind would move in ways that seemed deliberate, turning leaves into patterns that resembled symbols or letters she did not understand but felt deep within her chest. Even the earth itself seemed responsive. Stones shifted to provide a stepping path where none existed, or the ground trembled slightly underfoot, almost as if it were testing her determination. Each of these signs, while initially confusing, began to accumulate into a pattern she could not ignore. She realized that the forces around her were aligned not against her but in her favor, silently preparing her for the trials to come. Her senses sharpened in response. She could hear distant sounds with uncanny clarity, the crack of a branch, the approach of a predator, or the faint whisper of someone calling for help miles away. Colors seemed brighter, the sun warmer, and even the night sky more alive with shifting constellations. She felt her body respond as well, muscles tightening instinctively when danger approached, her reflexes quicker, and her endurance longer than before. Though she did not yet understand the full extent of these abilities, she knew they were gifts, latent powers meant to aid her. They were rewards for her suffering and tools to ensure that when the time came, she could reclaim what had been taken from her and confront those who had wronged her. Even mundane moments carried significance. When she placed her hand on a stone, it sometimes vibrated beneath her fingertips, sending a shiver of warmth up her arm. When she drank from a stream, the water occasionally seemed to shimmer or leave a subtle tingling in her mouth, almost as if it carried a message. Animals that had once fled from her began to approach with trust or curiosity, guiding her toward edible plants or safe resting spots. These phenomena no longer frightened her. Instead, they became evidence that she was chosen, that her hardships were shaping her into someone capable of extraordinary deeds. The natural world, she realized, was no longer neutral but an ally in her journey. Even her stepmother's cruelty, though distant, seemed to fuel the awakening of her powers. Every memory of being ignored, humiliated, or abandoned acted as a spark, intensifying her latent abilities. The injustice she had suffered was no longer a weight meant to crush her. It was transforming into energy, a source of strength she could harness. In dreams, she saw herself standing before her oppressors, not as the frail girl who had once cried in secret, but as someone radiant with authority and power. The visions were clear. Patience, cunning, and inner strength would be her weapons, and the spirits would ensure she had the guidance to wield them wisely. The girl felt a growing thrill at the thought that one day, she would return to the village not as a victim but as a force no one could ignore. By observing patterns in these occurrences, she began to test them cautiously. If a wind shifted oddly, she followed it, discovering hidden water or safe paths. If an animal lingered unusually close, she noted the direction it moved, sometimes leading her to fruit-bearing trees or sheltered caves. Even the whispering voices of ancestors seemed to respond when she focused her attention, offering cryptic but helpful advice. Each success, however small, reinforced her belief that these were not coincidences but deliberate interventions. She began to trust in the unseen, understanding that her journey was not solitary and that guidance from the spiritual realm had chosen her as its pupil. Through all of this, her spirit grew stronger than ever. Though her stomach ached and her body remained weakened from exile, her heart brimmed with hope and confidence. The sense of being chosen, the connection to ancestral spirits, and the manifestation of hidden powers transformed her understanding of herself. She was no longer merely a victim, she was becoming an agent of destiny. Each day of survival, each dream, each subtle phenomenon in the natural world acted as a rehearsal, preparing her for the moment when she would confront injustice and reclaim her rightful place. She felt a quiet certainty that her return would not be ordinary, she would come back radiant, powerful, and unyielding, the embodiment of justice itself. By the time weeks had passed, the girl's awareness of her powers became nearly constant. Even in ordinary moments, gathering food, seeking shelter, or moving cautiously through the wilderness, she felt the subtle hum of magic, a faint vibration in the air that confirmed she was being guided. Dreams became lessons, whispers became counsel, omens became signs of imminent opportunity. She learned to listen, to observe, and to trust in the hidden currents that flowed around her. The latent abilities within her were no longer dormant. They were awakening, shaping her body, mind, and spirit into a force that would one day transform fear into respect, despair into triumph, and cruelty into justice. The girl, once powerless and overlooked, was beginning to become the embodiment of destiny itself. After sensing the subtle guidance of unseen forces and recognizing the awakening of her latent abilities, the girl knew that mere survival would not be enough. She had to grow stronger not just physically but mentally, spiritually, and strategically. Each day became an opportunity to learn, to test herself, and to cultivate the talents that were emerging from within her. She began observing the natural world closely, noticing patterns in the behavior of animals, the movement of the wind, and the flow of water. These observations became her first lessons in strategy and adaptability. She realized that understanding the environment could provide her with the upper hand against any challenge, and that patience and careful planning often outweighed brute force. Mystical knowledge soon followed. In her dreams, the ancestral spirits who had begun whispering to her appeared more frequently and with greater clarity. They guided her through lessons in perception, intuition, and the manipulation of energy around her. In one dream, she learned to focus her thoughts and direct them toward subtle changes in the environment. A fallen branch could shift to block an approaching threat, or a faint breeze could carry a warning of danger. The spirits taught her to sense the intentions of those around her, to detect deceit, and to anticipate actions before they unfolded. This knowledge became invaluable, strengthening her confidence and teaching her that true power comes not just from strength but from awareness, insight, and precision. Physical training was equally important. Though her body had grown stronger through days of exile and survival, she now focused deliberately on developing agility, endurance, and resilience. She moved through forests, climbed rocky terrain, and balanced on narrow ledges, treating the wilderness as both classroom and gymnasium. Every misstep was a lesson in humility and adaptation. Every successful maneuver reinforced her belief in her capabilities. She learned to endure discomfort and fatigue, to remain calm in the face of pain, and to channel her energy strategically rather than react impulsively. Over time, her movements became fluid and confident, her reflexes sharp, and her stamina impressive. Each skill learned was another tool she could wield when confronting her enemies and reclaiming what was hers. Alliances also played a crucial role in her development. While alone, she often encountered creatures, birds, small mammals, and even stray domesticated animals, that showed unusual trust or loyalty toward her. She learned to communicate with them subtly, reading their signals, and using their behaviors to gather information or locate hidden resources. Later, she discovered others in the forests or mountains, humans who had once been wronged, outsiders or wanderers, who shared knowledge or skills with her. Though hesitant at first, she realized the importance of forming bonds and learning from those who had also faced adversity. These connections expanded her understanding of courage, resourcefulness, and cooperation. The girl began to grasp that strength is amplified when combined with trust, collaboration, and mutual support. Every small success, every lesson mastered, reinforced her growing self-confidence. She solved problems that once seemed insurmountable, navigated obstacles with patience and ingenuity, and endured challenges that would have broken her before. The combination of physical conditioning, mystical insight, and practical strategy built a sense of resilience that was both mental and emotional. She was no longer the frightened, powerless girl who had been cast aside. She was becoming a careful, deliberate, and formidable presence, capable of planning and executing actions with precision and purpose. Even her mind sharpened. She began recognizing patterns in behavior, understanding motives, and predicting outcomes. Intelligence, courage, and strategy intertwined to create a well-rounded force prepared for the trials ahead. Trial and error became her teacher. Sometimes her attempts failed, leaving her frustrated or in minor danger. Yet each setback was analyzed and understood. She learned to respect her environment, anticipate reactions, and remain flexible in the face of unpredictability. These failures were as crucial as her victories, instilling patience, humility, and adaptability. They reminded her that true mastery requires perseverance and that overconfidence could be as dangerous as weakness. The girl began to internalize a philosophy that blended wisdom, patience, and action. She would strike when the moment was right, guided by both her own judgment and the counsel of the spirits. The mystical aspect of her training deepened as well. She learned to sense energy flows in the world around her, feeling subtle vibrations in the earth, the air, and even the currents of thought and intention among people she encountered. Dreams became instructional, showing her techniques of influence, protection, and subtle manipulation of her surroundings. At times, the spirits guided her in practical experiments, moving objects, influencing the path of small animals, or creating minor effects that tested her control and concentration. These exercises strengthened her connection to the unseen world, heightening her intuition and enabling her to act decisively even when circumstances seemed chaotic or threatening. By the end of this period of training, the girl had transformed in every dimension. Her body was nimble, strong, and enduring, her mind sharp, analytical, and strategic, her spirit confident, resilient, and attuned to mystical guidance. She could move silently, react instantly, and make decisions with a clarity born of experience and preparation. Even more importantly, she had internalized the lessons of patience, observation, and controlled power. She understood that fear could be converted into focus, suffering into strength, and hardship into knowledge. Each skill, insight, and alliance she had acquired formed an arsenal far more formidable than any simple weapon. By now, the girl sensed the horizon of her destiny. She understood that her return to the village and the confrontation with her enemies was not merely an opportunity for revenge. It was a chance to restore balance, to demonstrate the power of resilience and justice, and to serve as a symbol of hope for others who had suffered. The preparation she had undertaken, the mystical lessons she had absorbed, and the practical skills she had honed were all converging to create a force both subtle and overwhelming. She had transformed from a powerless victim into a being of intelligence, courage, and undeniable presence, fully equipped to meet her fate and ensure that those who had wronged her would face the consequences of their cruelty. In this way, the girl's training and discovery became more than a phase of preparation. They were a crucible through which her mind, body, and spirit were forged into something extraordinary. She moved forward with confidence, aware of both her growing power and the responsibilities it entailed. The forest, the spirits, the allies, and the lessons they had imparted were now extensions of her will. She was no longer a passive observer in her life. She was an active force, ready to shape her destiny and bring justice to those who had sought to destroy her. The girl, once overlooked and powerless, now walked the path of a determined, skilled, and mystical force, destined to return and change her world forever. After months of training, learning, and discovering her hidden strengths, the girl knew that the time had come to return to the village and reclaim what had been taken from her. She stood at the edge of the forest, feeling the cool wind brush against her face, and allowed herself a moment to reflect on everything she had endured. Her mind was sharp, her body strong, and her spirit unwavering. But strength alone would not suffice. She needed a plan, a careful, deliberate strategy that would ensure justice was delivered not haphazardly, but with precision and undeniable force. She considered every detail, the weaknesses of her enemies, the resources she had at her disposal, and the patterns of behavior she had observed from a distance during her time in exile. Every step had to be calculated, every action had to serve a purpose. This was not a moment for impulsive revenge but for justice refined by wisdom and patience. Her first priority was intelligence. She began gathering information subtly, moving silently through the village outskirts, listening to conversations, observing routines, and noting the locations of those who had wronged her. She remembered the faces of her enemies, their habits, their fears, and their arrogance. These small details, when woven together, created a tapestry of vulnerability that she could exploit. Villagers who had previously ignored or mocked her were now seen in a new light. She considered their likely reactions, their loyalties, and the potential risks they posed to her plan. The girl realized that knowledge, more than raw power, would determine the success of her return. She committed each detail to memory, visualizing scenarios in which she could use it to her advantage, rehearsing her responses mentally until they became instinctive. Allies were the next crucial element. Though she had spent much of her exile in solitude, she had formed bonds with certain beings and individuals along her journey. The spirits that had guided her, the animals that had grown loyal to her presence, and the wandering allies she had met in remote regions all became part of her plan. She communicated with them quietly, ensuring each understood its role and timing. The spirits, in particular, offered insight beyond the natural world. They could influence perceptions, instill fear, and subtly manipulate circumstances to favor her. She envisioned their interventions as extensions of her own will, creating layers of strategy that were invisible to human eyes but potent in effect. She also considered the villagers who had once shown her kindness, planning to enlist their support or at least their neutrality. Every ally, whether human, mystical, or animal, became a component in a complex network that would allow her to execute her plan flawlessly. Magical insight further refined her strategy. During her time in exile, she had learned to sense the flow of energy, to perceive intentions, and to manipulate subtle forces around her. She could feel the village itself as a living, reactive entity, capable of responding to emotion, will, and action. This awareness allowed her to predict environmental shifts, anticipate obstacles, and use the surroundings to her advantage. She devised ways to turn ordinary objects into instruments of influence, to create illusions that would confuse or terrify her enemies, and to harness natural elements like wind, shadow, or fire in alignment with her actions. Magic was not a brute force in her plan. It was a precise instrument, used judiciously to amplify her strategy and protect her from unforeseen danger. Every movement, every gesture, and every decision was informed by the flow of this invisible power, guiding her toward maximum effect with minimum risk. Her mental preparation was equally rigorous. She visualized confrontations, rehearsed responses to possible betrayal, and contemplated the psychological impact of her actions on her enemies. She understood that justice could be as much about perception as about consequence. Instilling fear and awe in her oppressors would ensure that the lesson endured long after the initial events unfolded. She reviewed her own emotions carefully, balancing the desire for revenge with the necessity of restraint and precision. Rage, though potent, could cloud judgment. Fear could hinder decisiveness. She trained herself to channel these intense emotions into focused action, converting pain and anger into clarity and resolve. Her mind became a battlefield of planning, foresight, and control, shaping a strategy that was as psychological as it was practical. The girl also considered timing and sequence. Every element of her plan had to unfold in a deliberate order to maximize impact and minimize risk. She decided when and where she would appear, how to use her allies most effectively, and the precise moments to deploy magical influence. She imagined the reactions of her enemies, predicting panic, hesitation, or defiance, and prepared contingencies for each possibility. Nothing was left to chance. Every scenario had been anticipated, and every variable accounted for. This meticulous planning ensured that her justice would not only be effective but undeniable. Her enemies would see, understand, and experience the consequences of their cruelty with clarity that left no room for doubt or excuse. Finally, the emotional and spiritual dimension of her plan became central. She invoked the guidance of the spirits who had nurtured her growth, seeking their blessing and alignment with her intentions. Their presence reinforced her confidence and infused her strategy with a moral certainty. This was not a pursuit of petty revenge, but a restoration of balance, a reclamation of dignity, and a demonstration of cosmic justice. Every ally, every action, and every magical intervention was tied to this deeper purpose, giving her plan not only precision but righteousness. She was aware that the path she had chosen would not only change her life but also leave a lasting lesson for the village and future generations. With the plan fully formed, the girl felt a sense of calm determination. She had transformed from a victim into a strategist, a solitary wanderer into a commanding presence, and a powerless innocent into a force guided by intelligence, courage, and supernatural insight. Every detail had been considered, every ally aligned, and every mystical insight integrated. Her mind, body, and spirit were united in preparation, ready to execute a plan that would restore justice, exact consequences for the wicked, and demonstrate the profound power of resilience and foresight. The girl took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of silent reflection, knowing that soon she would step back into the world that had wronged her and deliver a justice that was both inevitable and extraordinary. After months of meticulous preparation, the girl approached the village from the forest's edge, her every step deliberate and confident. The early morning mist clung to the ground, yet she moved with certainty, her eyes scanning familiar landmarks that now carried the weight of her memories, both tender and painful. Each hut, each pathway, and each familiar tree seemed to acknowledge her presence in subtle ways, the air itself vibrating as if anticipating the change that her return would bring. She breathed in deeply, feeling a mixture of resolve and the quiet thrill of imminent justice. The girl's once timid and gentle demeanor had been transformed into one of quiet authority, tempered by months of training, mystical guidance, and unwavering focus on her purpose. Her every movement exuded calm control, radiating confidence that seemed almost tangible to those who observed from afar. The villagers, going about their early morning chores, began to notice a shift in the atmosphere. The wind seemed to carry a weight, the shadows stretched differently, and even the light felt altered, as though the village itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. As she entered the first open area, small details registered. The baker kneading dough paused, sensing a presence that was both familiar and profoundly different. Children playing in the dirt froze mid-step, instinctively retreating behind their parents, their eyes wide with awe and curiosity. Women carrying baskets of water hesitated, unsure whether to continue with their routines. Even the livestock seemed unsettled, their low murmurs and movements betraying a tension that had silently crept into the village. The girl's approach was deliberate yet understated. She did not announce herself with words or gestures, but her aura, the combination of authority, calm power, and unmistakable presence, was enough to communicate that she was no longer the fragile, powerless girl the village had once dismissed. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd as they noticed the transformation. "Is that her?" one villager murmured. "She has changed, something is different," another replied. The gossip spread quickly, building a quiet tension that seemed to thrum in the very air. Her enemies, however, reacted differently. The stepmother, who had once wielded control through fear and manipulation, sensed a shift before the girl was even visible. The moment she caught sight of her former victim's silhouette approaching through the mist, a cold shiver ran down her spine. Her mind raced. This was no ordinary girl returning. She noticed the precision in her step, the unyielding determination in her gaze, and the subtle glow that seemed to emanate from her presence, as if some unseen force followed her closely. Fear, long buried beneath arrogance, surfaced suddenly and violently. The stepmother's accomplices also felt it, their confidence evaporating as they realized that the girl they had tormented and betrayed had returned not as prey, but as a force beyond their comprehension. Panic flickered in their eyes as they whispered to one another, trying to mask the tremor in their voices, but the girl noticed every reaction, every small movement betraying the terror that had begun to take root. She slowed her pace intentionally, giving them the time to fully sense the magnitude of her transformation. Each heartbeat of fear that echoed in their chests was a subtle reinforcement of the justice she had come to deliver. As she moved deeper into the village, the narrative of her presence unfolded like a story written in the reactions of those around her. Villagers who had once ignored her, laughed at her misfortunes, or participated in her suffering now looked at her with a mixture of reverence and trepidation. The children who had seen her as fragile and weak, now whispered to each other in awe, pointing at her and imagining stories of power and magic. Older villagers recalled the injustices of the past, their guilt tempered by the relief of witnessing someone rise above cruelty and claim rightful authority. The air seemed charged, every glance and gesture amplifying the anticipation of what was to come. Even the animals, attuned to her presence, shifted uneasily, sensing the unspoken power she carried. She did not rush, for urgency would betray impatience. She allowed the tension to build naturally, letting each observer experience the realization that the girl who had once suffered was now in command of her destiny. Her arrival at the central square, where the marketplace had once bustled with ordinary life, became a focal point. People paused mid-task, their routines disrupted by the undeniable magnetism of her presence. The stepmother emerged from her dwelling, trying to maintain composure, yet her eyes betrayed mounting dread. Each step the girl took amplified the psychological tension. The villagers, now fully aware of the girl's transformation, felt a mixture of excitement, fear, and respect. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, men straightened instinctively, and elders muttered prayers or invoked blessings. Every reaction reinforced the girl's understanding that her plan for justice had been laid carefully and strategically, and now she had arrived at the critical moment where perception and reality would merge. Her calm, deliberate gaze swept across the faces before her, cataloging every reaction, every sign of recognition, and every flicker of fear or hope. By the time she reached the heart of the village, the shift in power dynamics was complete. No longer was she a victim to be overlooked or dismissed. She was a presence that demanded attention, commanded respect, and inspired awe. The stepmother and her accomplices, their confidence shattered, realized that the girl's return was not merely symbolic, it was actionable, deliberate, and unstoppable. Villagers silently watched as the atmosphere crackled with anticipation, understanding instinctively that justice was imminent, and that the girl they had once ignored had returned with the strength, strategy, and supernatural insight necessary to reshape the village's moral and social order. The moment was charged with expectation, suspense, and the unspoken promise of reckoning, setting the stage for the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. The moment had come when the girl, having revealed the truth of her suffering and reclaimed her stolen possessions, turned her attention to ensuring that justice would be fully enacted. The villagers, still stunned by the display of supernatural signs and tangible evidence, watched closely, understanding that the girl's return was not merely a personal vindication, it was a reckoning. Every whisper in the wind, every glimmer of light, and every subtle tremor underfoot seemed to affirm the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Her stepmother and her accomplices stood at the center of the square, their faces pale, eyes darting nervously as they began to sense the magnitude of forces aligned against them. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, an unspoken understanding that cruelty could no longer remain unpunished. The girl began with the stepmother, whose long-standing envy, greed, and malice had orchestrated her suffering. Slowly, methodically, she narrated each act of wrongdoing, highlighting the consequences of those actions not only for the girl but for the moral order of the village itself. The stepmother flinched as her own deeds were laid bare, realizing that denial or deception would no longer suffice. It was as if the spirits themselves had guided the girl's words, ensuring that no falsehood could escape exposure. Then, subtly, the environment responded. Objects the stepmother had once used to harm or control the girl began to shift of their own accord, tracing the paths of deceit she had walked. Her possessions rattled, her doors creaked, and whispers, faint yet insistent, echoed her own guilt back to her. The villagers looked on in awe as the cosmic balance began to manifest, demonstrating that cruelty could not stand unchallenged. Next, the girl's attention turned to the stepmother's accomplices. Each person who had aided in her oppression, whether through active participation or silent complicity, felt the weight of justice bearing down. Tools, tokens, or items that symbolized their roles in her suffering moved as if guided by unseen hands, creating a sense of entrapment that went beyond mere physical intimidation. The girl's calm voice narrated their complicity, each accusation underscored by subtle supernatural signs. Shadows lengthened, faint glowing symbols appeared at their feet, and the wind seemed to carry whispers of their own guilt. They tried to flee, but the energy around them subtly restricted their movements, forcing them to confront the reality of their actions. Each gesture, glance, or word from the girl reinforced the certainty that cosmic justice was at work, leaving no room for denial or escape. The villagers, many of whom had previously been silent witnesses or hesitant participants in the cruelty, now became an active audience to the enforcement of justice. Some murmured apologies for their inaction, while others simply watched, awestruck and silent, as the girl orchestrated the punishment with a blend of authority and supernatural validation. She did not act in anger. Her actions were precise, measured, and guided by a sense of moral inevitability. This approach emphasized the difference between vengeance born of spite and justice aligned with cosmic or moral order. The girl's every movement, every display of power, communicated the principle that those who harm the innocent will ultimately face consequences far beyond what human hands alone can deliver. As the punishment unfolded, it became clear that it was not merely physical or social but deeply spiritual. The oppressors experienced visions of their misdeeds, felt the weight of the suffering they had caused, and confronted the fear and despair they had inflicted on others. Some were struck with temporary madness, their minds overwhelmed by the vivid replay of cruelty they had committed. Others were rendered unable to act, forced to witness their own powerlessness as the girl's justice unfolded. The cosmic force guiding her actions seemed to ensure that each punishment fit the wrongdoing. Those who had exploited, lied, or acted out of envy and greed experienced corresponding consequences that made the lesson unmistakable. Simultaneously, the villagers observed that the girl herself remained unharmed and composed, her presence radiant and commanding. This contrast between her calm authority and the suffering of her oppressors reinforced the lesson. Innocence, virtue, and courage are protected, and those who act with malice invite ruin upon themselves. The air shimmered subtly with energy and small, almost imperceptible movements, leaves fluttering, shadows bending, and sparks of light tracing paths of truth, symbolized the moral restoration that was taking place. Each of these signs served to ingrain in the minds of the villagers that the universe, or the spiritual forces watching over her, were invested in ensuring that justice prevailed. By the time the enactment of punishment reached its climax, the oppressors were left humbled, defeated, and unable to deny the consequences of their actions. Some were exiled, others publicly shamed, and a few experienced symbolic or supernatural manifestations of ruin that left the village in awe. Their power, once unchecked, had been fully neutralized by a combination of human strategy, spiritual guidance, and moral inevitability. Every element of the event, the restored possessions, the environmental signs, and the girl's unwavering composure, served to make the principle clear. Cruelty leads to downfall, and the innocent, when guided by courage and cosmic justice, will be protected. Finally, the girl addressed the villagers, not with boastful triumph but with a serene declaration that justice had been served. She emphasized that this enforcement was not merely personal revenge, but a lesson for the community. Cruelty cannot endure unpunished, and righteousness, patience, and courage carry their own forms of protection. The villagers absorbed the lesson, recognizing that the girl's return and the punishment of the oppressors symbolized a restoration of balance, a cosmic affirmation that the moral order is resilient and that every act of malice carries consequences. By the end, the village had witnessed a transformation. The oppressors were humbled and removed from positions of influence, the girl's rightful place was restored, and the invisible, moral, and cosmic forces that had guided her actions were acknowledged by all. Justice had been enforced in a manner that was as visible as it was spiritual, as precise as it was inevitable. The lesson was unmistakable. Those who harm the innocent will face ruin, while courage, resilience, and virtue are protected, celebrated, and ultimately rewarded. With the oppressors punished and the cosmic balance restored, the girl stepped into a new phase of her life, one marked not by suffering but by recognition, respect, and empowerment. The villagers who had once dismissed her, mocked her, or stood silent in the face of cruelty, now looked upon her with awe. She moved through the village with calm authority, her presence radiating a quiet strength that needed no words to command attention. Her eyes, once filled with fear and sorrow, now shone with wisdom and confidence, reflecting the experiences that had shaped her journey. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, and symbolic of the transformation she had undergone, from a powerless victim to a beacon of justice and virtue. The culture of the village itself began to shift. People who had previously thrived on envy, deceit, or neglect of the weak now witnessed firsthand the consequences of cruelty. Conversations changed. Elders taught stories of her perseverance and courage to the children, embedding the values of empathy, fairness, and respect in the next generation. Villagers who had once been indifferent now took active roles in supporting one another, fostering a community where kindness was recognized and cruelty feared. Her presence served as a living testament to the principle that injustice cannot thrive indefinitely, and that virtue, patience, and moral courage are ultimately rewarded. Beyond moral influence, the girl's experiences endowed her with practical wisdom that the village embraced. She advised on matters of dispute, counsel, and resource management, ensuring fairness in dealings that had previously been tainted by favoritism or selfishness. Her decisions were respected because they were grounded in justice, tempered by empathy, and reinforced by the undeniable proof of her supernatural guidance and resilience. Villagers no longer feared her, they admired her. And in that admiration lay the foundation for lasting change. A society learning from its past mistakes, inspired by the strength of one who had endured immense suffering and emerged victorious. Subtle signs indicated that her influence extended beyond the visible realm. The land seemed to prosper under her watchful presence. Crops flourished, the air carried a gentle calm, and even small animals moved with a sense of reassurance. Elders whispered that the spirits who had guided and protected her continued to lend their blessings, ensuring that her leadership was not only wise but spiritually supported. This understanding instilled confidence in the villagers that the girl's rise was more than temporal. It was the beginning of an era where fairness and protection of the innocent were safeguarded by both human and mystical forces. The girl also became a mentor and guide. Young women and men who once felt powerless or overlooked sought her counsel, inspired by her courage and resilience. She shared the lessons of perseverance, strategic thinking, and moral integrity that had carried her through exile, suffering, and eventual triumph. Her story became a living curriculum, a source of hope that even the most overwhelming adversity could be overcome when guided by courage, wisdom, and faith in justice. In her personal life, she found peace and contentment. Freed from oppression, she cultivated friendships and alliances built on mutual respect rather than fear. She honored those who had quietly supported her, nurturing a network of trust that extended throughout the village. Her legacy was already taking root, not just as a figure of power, but as a symbol of moral and spiritual resilience, someone whose trials had forged a path of safety, prosperity, and ethical clarity for generations to come. As dawn broke each day, it illuminated a village transformed. The girl's journey from suffering to empowerment was etched into the hearts and minds of the people, a perpetual reminder that injustice may rise temporarily, but truth, virtue, and courage ultimately prevail. Her story became both legend and blueprint, an enduring guide that ensured fairness, honored the innocent, and promised protection for the future. In her rise, the village discovered a new era, one where power was tempered by justice, strength by wisdom, and prosperity by respect for the moral order.